my name is Tom Lyons. I am a support engineer with Inflow Communications. I've been here for about 4 years. And today's topic for our webinar is going to be redundancy within the ShoreTel system. And specifically, what we're going to go over today is how to set up your switches, trunks with both the ShoreTel side and the carrier side, and also things like your communicator functionality to make sure that you're in a redundant state, so that if you do have an issue with your system, you can continue to use those functions unimpeded or as little of a problem as possible. So some of the overviews that we're going to provide, for example, is how to set up spare switches, how those work in your environment for IP failover, what those VVS servers can actually provide for you for redundant fashion for your system, and also how to set up a redundant link for trunks with your carrier and with the ShoreTel system to make sure that if you have a primary link failure, you are still able to make and receive calls. It is important to note, what we are going over today is more of an overview of what you can do for redundancy in the ShoreTel system. If you are looking to set up a redundant state for your system, I would get in touch with your account rep to see what options we have available for you, and they will get you in touch with a project manager to get that set up for you. In addition, this presentation does cover the PBX side of failover. If you're looking for more information on contact center failover, we will provide that in another webinar. Also, if you need that information sooner rather than later, feel free to shoot us an email after the presentation or contact our support, and we will be able to get you the information that you require for that. So what we're going to do here is we're going to go through a few slides, and I'm going to go over the overview of how to get this stuff set up in your system and what you would want to do. And I'm also going to elaborate on my points here. We're actually going to start with IP phone redundancy, because this is the piece that most people already have in their environment. But in a lot of cases, we see it incorrectly configured, and this can lead to the failover just not working at all when you actually have a problem. So I wanted to go over that piece first. IP phone redundancy can be handled by either a physical or a virtual switch set up as a spare switch within the ShoreTel directory. And when I say spare switch, what you are likely used to doing is going into your platform equipment or platform hardware in 14.2 and then setting up a primary switch, which is where you would normally set up your production switches, so like your SG50s and 90s, or your T1Ks, or your virtual trunk and virtual phone switches. What is right under there is actually a spare piece that is used to set up these IP phone failover switches. And you can use anything that you have available. This can be something like an SG30, 50, or 90. It can be a VSwitch, like a 50 or 90V. And it can also be a virtual phone switch. These will be set up as a spare switch to allow you to fail your phones over in the case that your primary switch does have a problem and goes down. The way that you want to set those up, and this is very important, you'll see the second bullet point there, you want to place these spares at your headquarters site and not specific to the site that they are going to be at. The reason for this is because the ShoreTel system operates on a tree hierarchy, meaning that everything is kind of a child of the parent site, so the headquarters site. With the IP phone failover, the way that this works is if anything at one of the child sites goes down, if you have a spare switch at the headquarters site, the spare at the headquarters can actually move itself into the site that has the failure and take over the phones there. This will give you the ability to actually have failover for all of your sites as opposed to only having it at one or two. So it is very important to set those up at the headquarters site. We do often see those set up at the site that they are specifically supposed to monitor. And while that's good for that site, it wouldn't have any effect if something at headquarters went down or if another site went down. Primarily, we do recommend using a virtual switch for this purpose. The reason for that is that the virtual switches, with the appropriate amount of resources applied to them, can support up to 1,000 IP phones per switch. Obviously, this is much more robust than a SG50 or SG90, which can support 50 or 90 phones respectively. And this is dependent on how many resources you allocate to the switch, but even at lower allocations, they can support up to 250 phones. So they're definitely the switch that I would recommend for this purpose. How the failover works for the IP phone redundancy is fairly simple. The phones basically pull the managing switch that they have every 3 minutes to see if there is a problem with that connection to the switch. If the IP phone failover is enabled in Director, which we'll get to in a second here, and the switch that's managing the phone is no longer accessible by the phone, it will actually kick a message to the managing switch or the config switch that's within Director and say, hey, my switch is down. I need another switch to talk to. The config switch will then reach out to the spare and say there's been a failure, at which point the spare will kick in and it will go to the appropriate site that these phones are at. It will grab the phones that are having a problem, and those phones will automatically register with the spare switch. Because of the way that the calls work in the ShoreTel system, these phones will actually not lose calls, assuming that it wasn't a failure that also affected the trunks in your system, because the switches are actually used for call setup only. Once the calls are in progress, the IP phones are talking directly to the other endpoint. With this in mind, if you do have IP phone failover, you can expect a seamless transition because the phone does not have to check in directly with the phone switch during the middle of the call. And this does work the same way for both physical and virtual switches. So that is something to keep in mind. If you do have a spare SG50 sitting on a shelf and you don't have any spare switches in your environment, this is a great reason to use it. There are some limitations for IP phone redundancy. So to go over those really quickly here, virtual switches only have VMware support. And this is actually has to do with the bus logic for the SCSI bus on the back end of the switches themselves. Hyper-V does not have the correct support for these virtual switches, so it is not currently supported. If you have VMware, we can spin up a virtual switch. Otherwise, you would need to have a physical switch in play for failover. One of the other limitations is that one spare switch cannot support multiple sites at the same time. So as an example of this, let's say you have 5 sites in your environment. You have one spare switch at your headquarters site. If one of those remote sites goes down, that switch is going to kick in, and then it is going to allocate itself to the site that actually had the problem and pick up the phones there. If you then have another site go down, then the spare switch that's already allocated to the first site that had a problem is not going to be able to respond because it's already allocated to the site that had the issue first. So for this reason, if you have multiple sites and you want to provide redundancy that could potentially affect multiple sites at the same time, then you would want to set multiple spare switches up at the same time so that you always have a couple available even if a site does have a problem. This is, again, much easier to do using virtual switches, which is why we heavily support those, or heavily recommend those, rather. The other piece to this is IP phone failover is actually an option in Shoreware Director. And what many people miss is actually turning this feature on. As a result, if you don't turn this on, then what will occur is your phones will lose their connection to the managing switch, but then they won't actually do anything because they don't have the firmware bit turned on to actually look for another switch. They would just assume they are down and they will go down. And in this particular case, when the phones do lose that connectivity, once you're off any actual calls, you're going to lose the ability to use those phones until the switch in question comes back up. So there's 2 pieces to that that are very important. It's in IP phone options. So if you click on IP phones in Director and then you click on the options submenu, which is the last option under IP phones, there is a checkbox for allow IP phone failover. When you check that, you're actually going to get a pop-up as well that says that all the phones need to be rebooted. Now, you don't need to be alarmed. It is not going to reboot all your phones when you check the box. However, until you check the box, IP phone failover is not going to work. So it's very important to note that. One exception to that rule is if you have all 400 series phones. We have done some testing, and that actually does kick in when you do check the box. But if you do have 200 series phones or any of the older ShoreTel models, you do need to reboot them after checking that box to make sure that they will be able to fail over. Another topic that people ask about a lot is Communicator redundancy. So the ability to use your Communicator client and make sure that you're not going to lose that connectivity if the server goes down. That is going to be primarily managed by DVS servers. If you're not familiar with what a DVS server is, or a distributed voicemail server, what this server does is essentially provides a bare bones director side service center for remote sites. And also, if you just have a lot of stuff going on at your HQ site, you will often see servers, extra servers there as well. What these will do is for the remote sites, it will actually provide communicator services as well as local voicemail and prompt services for remote sites. Prompt services assuming there are trunks at those remote sites. So you can actually host your voicemail locally. And then if you have trunks coming in, any auto attendant prompts, instead of having to play on the HQ server, would actually go through and use the DVS server for those functions. The same is true for any VSwitches. So if you have a 50 or 90 V at a remote site, that 50 or 90 V is also going to handle the local voicemail and prompt services for those users. To get redundancy for Communicator, what you would want to do is provide a local DVS, so a server running the distributed voicemail server software at the remote sites. And then for the users in question, you want to point their Communicator client at the headquarters server. And the way that this works is when you use the pointer at the HQ in conjunction with that local DVS, the system will look and then note where your phone is on the system. So in this case, let's say we have a headquarters site in Portland, and we have a child site in San Francisco that has a distributed voicemail server. When you set up a Communicator client in San Francisco and point it at the headquarters server in Portland, what will happen is the server will check in, it will see the connection, it will then look at the phone that you are managing using your Communicator, and notice that it is in San Francisco. It will then check to see if there is a DVS server at that location, and because there is, it will actually redirect your Communicator client to talk to that local server. The benefit of that is if the HQ goes down, and it's already pointed at the DVS server there, Communicator function is going to work. The other piece to this is because of the tree hierarchy that I mentioned before, everything fails up to the parent site. And so if you have a local DVS failure, because Communicator is already pointed at the HQ, and HQ is actually redirecting that connection, when it loses communication, it's going to reach back out to the HQ, which is then going to say, okay, your local DVS server is down, you can use me. And the end result is going to be you might lose connectivity to Communicator for a few seconds, but then Communicator is going to come right back up, and it is going to be able to talk for you. So this is how you set up Communicator redundancy. This is a little bit different from how voicemail redundancy works, and we are going to get into that at the end, but this is specifically for the Communicator client. Another hot topic is workgroups. And workgroups are kind of a special case in the ShoreTel system. So to go over how this works here, workgroups kind of like what you can do with hunt groups and their corresponding switches can actually reside on any server of your choosing that's in your hierarchy. So for example, in that same example with the Portland and San Francisco servers, if I have a group that's specific to the San Francisco server, or the San Francisco site rather, I can actually host the workgroup on the DVS that is located in San Francisco to take the link out of the equation between Portland and San Francisco and let that work just right at that local site. That will already give you some redundancy in terms of if there's a link failure between Portland and San Francisco, assuming that there are trunks in San Francisco that are allowing you to take those calls. So you can do that for local usage just like you can with a hunt group. However, unlike a lot of other things in the system, like the IP phone failover or the fail up for Communicator, workgroups do not automatically fail over in the system. And there's no way to configure this in that way. This is because the workgroups are not actually distributed across servers. They only reside on the server that you specify in order for the operation to occur. So in this particular case, if the workgroup is hosted on San Francisco, and the server goes down, that workgroup is not going to be able to take calls, and it does not automatically go up to the HQ site. With that in mind, there's a few things that you can do. The best practice that Inflow recommends is to set up a hunt group as a backup extension for the workgroup. If you've set up a workgroup before, you've probably seen the backup extension that is the third row down when you create the workgroup. It's actually a required field. It will not let you save a work group without having a backup extension listed. If you have a local hunt group, which resides on one of the phone switches at a site, you can set that up as the backup group. And our recommendation is to set that up so that the key players from the work group, or everybody, if it's a smaller work group, are in that hunt group. And that will provide basic call fielding functionality if the work group is unable to answer. So that gives you the redundancy that you're looking for there. The other thing you can potentially do is, just like with the switch, there is a managing server drop-down list in Director. If in this particular case San Francisco goes down, you could, in theory, move the work group from the San Francisco server to the Portland server. And once that resyncs, you will be able to take calls again, assuming that the link connection is good and all of the ports are open, so that the services from San Francisco can talk to Portland without an issue. This is not the case if the Director server actually goes down. This is because the Director server is required for any changes that are made on the ShoreTel system. If this goes down, you would not be able to browse to Director. And the DVSs are not capable of making changes because they only have a read-only copy of the database. This is due to SQL limitations. SQL is the backend database that is used on the ShoreTel system. So it is made with that concept in mind to make sure that there will be no database corruption. So if you need to make a change, you do need to get the headquarters server back up. There is a supported application to provide full redundancy for the HQ. I will touch on that at the end here. It is not something that is directly provided by ShoreTel. Trunk redundancy. This is another big one. A lot of customers want to be able to provide a redundant link for their trunk so that in the event of a failover, they will continue to be able to get calls inbound and outbound while the primary trunk group is resolved. The good news is this can definitely be done in the ShoreTel system. It does require some coordination with your carrier. This can be done with both PRIs and SIP trunks. SIP trunks are typically a little bit easier to manage for a failover situation. And what you would essentially be looking at doing for this would be geographic redundancy. Geographic redundancy is key because you want to make sure that if it's a regionally affecting problem, so like maybe it's the whole Portland metro area that has a problem, you don't want your disaster recovery to be in Milwaukee and then your primary to be in Portland, because they could both potentially have the same issue if there's a core service that's being affected on the carrier level. So they will typically work with you to try and help you set that up. The common ways that we normally see this set up is using a colocation facility that has a secure connection. And often also maybe another primary site for the business will host another series of SIP trunks or a PRI. In conjunction with this, what you would need to do is you would need to make sure that your user groups that need this redundancy are set up to use both trunk groups, because this will allow them to seamlessly make those calls when the primary trunk fails over. These are typically set up as an active circuit with a failover circuit ready to go, meaning that the primary circuit will take all of your inbound and outbound calls, and the failover circuit will not actually be used for any purpose unless it's needed. And this can happen in a variety of ways. The most often method that we see here is when the carrier side equipment has a problem, the carrier will automatically switch their route and send everything across the secondary trunk. Then on the ShoreTel side, what you would do is you would then go in and make sure that all the numbers that you need to route properly are set up in DNS mapping, which we've covered in other webinars, to make sure that those calls route correctly. That way, no matter which trunk gets the incoming call, you would be able to get those calls routed properly. Then in addition, because of the way the failover is set up for outbound, it is typically a little bit easier to work with SIP for these failover scenarios. The reason being actually local calls. The way the system works in the ShoreTel environment is it will actually check the site parameters to see if a call is local, and then it's going to look for trunks that also see the call as local. Because PRIs in different geographic locations are going to treat different numbers differently and usually have different dialing rules, where you might dial 7 digits for a local call, and that's what we send to the trunk, versus you dial the full number with a 1 for long distance. Often what will happen is that secondary PRI does not have the ability to treat a local call from the original site as local for it, and you can run into issues with being able to dial local numbers. With SIP circuits, this is often not the case because they often require the same number of digits regardless of if it's a local or long distance call, and they treat them the same way. So with that in mind, it's a lot easier to set those up so that local calls will be unimpeded as well. And then we also have a quick frequently asked questions for failover here. One I already kind of touched on. Can we make changes to director from a DVS? The answer to that is no. The headquarters server must be available and up in order to make any director changes. And when I say available and up, I mean the server has to be running and the services have to be running. In particular, the config services on the server have to be able to operate, and the database has to be readable in order for it to make changes. DVS servers have a read-only database that they basically grab from the headquarters server, and this is the same even if you actually check the box for a local copy of the database on the DVS. Because of this, you are not going to be able to make any changes from the DVS server. The headquarters server does have to be available. In addition, the headquarters server is the only server out of any server in your system that's going to allow a login to the director appliance. So that without having that up, you are not even going to be able to log in. A good follow-up with that one is there a way to make the HQ server fully redundant? ShoreTel does not have its own in-house solution for this. However, they do support a piece of software called DoubleTake, which is essentially a heartbeat that will then bring up a fully cloned version of the HQ and assume its identity. This is a little bit more advanced setup. If this is something that you're looking into and something that you would want to get set up, you would need to purchase the DoubleTake software, and you would also want to get with your account rep so that we can schedule you with one of our project engineers and get that ball rolling. There is a few considerations you'll need to make, like making sure that you can take over the DNS name of the server, make sure that you're using the DNS name for the server for Communicator functionality instead of the IP address, because the IP address is going to potentially be a roadblock for you if you have to bring that server up and it's at a different facility on a different subnet, which is ideally what you would want to do for that. But yes, if that's something that you were looking for, we can help you with that. There's just a few moving pieces that you need to set up for that. And then finally, what about voicemail? When a server hosting voicemail goes down, what will happen is if I try to leave you a voicemail message, I'm still going to be able to get to your voicemail box, and I'm still going to be able to leave you a message. You're not going to be able to get those messages very easily because your client is going to have a hard time logging in. However, what will happen is the temporary management from the other server, so in this case, usually the HQ server if their DVS fails, is going to store those voicemails. And then when the server that hosts your voicemail box comes back up, it will use SMTP to then actually merge those stored voicemails on the temporary host over to the voicemail server that is normally used for your operation. It is also extremely, extremely important that you don't use the batch update utility to move mailboxes from a server that is down. What will happen is the mailbox will successfully move because the record for where the mailbox goes is on the director server. However, when it does this, what it tries to do is it tries to use SMTP to migrate any data from any stored voicemails from the old server to the new server. And what will happen is if the server is down, it will not be able to grab those records, but it's also not going to sit and wait for those records. It's going to assume that the operation was completed successfully. And so what's going to happen as a result of this is your mailbox is going to be moved, but any mail that was in those mailboxes is no longer going to be accessible via Communicator or by logging into the voicemail box using the phone. So that is very important to consider. You can still, in theory, go back and get those voicemails from the old server once it's up. It would be a manual process, and you would have to dig through all the voicemails on the system because of the way that the nomenclature works in the ShoreTel system. There's no easy way to see which voicemail is which. So this is a very, very important piece. And with that, that is our general overview for redundancy. I know we went through a very broad overview here. If you do have any specific questions on how redundancy works, feel free to ask them now in chat. I do see that we have a couple of questions there, and I'll go through those in a second. So if you have any, go ahead and shoot those in. I'll go through those here. In addition, if we have any questions that I can't answer immediately here, we will send an email out at the end, and we will be able to get you what you need. So with that, I will go ahead and I'm going to wait a second here to see if any more questions pop in. Then I'm going to go through the questions that we have available. It looks like we have 3 right now. All right, looks like we have a couple now. I'm going to just go through the questions in the order that we have them here. So the first question I have is, how does phone failover work for SIP registered devices? And the answer, unfortunately, is not as seamlessly as a ShoreTel MGCP phone is going to work. The third-party SIP devices, and so when we're talking about these, we're talking about Polycoms or life-size devices, things of that nature. They require a ShoreTel switch that has SIP proxy, which is also set at the site level to tell the phones where to go for the SIP proxy resources. And they're also statically assigned in the configuration of the SIP phones to point at a particular server. So because of this, if you only have one SIP proxy switch at a site and that switch goes down, those SIP devices are not going to operate until that device comes back up. Now, there is one caveat to that, and that is if you do set up multiple switches that have SIP proxy resources, you can actually create a virtual IP address at the site level that can be used to basically load balance that behavior. And if switch A goes down, in that case, if you are pointed at the virtual IP, that can move because the virtual IP is going to actually be load balanced. This is dependent on the config switches as well, because that operation is handled by the config switches. And when I say that, those are those 2 config switch slots. If you go into IP phone options, what those do is they actually tell the phones as they register, and also for failover, where to go when they check in. So they're not necessarily, the number 1 or number 2 switch that phones are registered to. Those are just the switches that handle the assignment of phones to other switches in the hierarchy. Let's see. Next question here. I had to step away. Will this be recorded for later viewing? Yes, this is being recorded. It'll be uploaded to the Inflow YouTube channel after it gets processed. It does typically take about a week for them to get back up on the YouTube channel. And then also there is a link in the chat here as well that Chelsea provided. You can follow that link, and that will bring you to where you need to go to see that. So the username is Inflowcom, INFLOWCOMM on YouTube. The next question I see here, the issue with trunk redundancy is caller ID going out 2 different carriers. I have yet to figure out how to get around this issue. So this does heavily depend on who you're using, what combination of carriers you're using, and what settings they require. Based on the question, it sounds like we are using 2 different carriers for the trunk redundancy here. Typically, when we advise for a failover scenario, we do advise to go with the same carrier where you can, so that you have the same trunk dialing rules to follow. Because some carriers will allow any caller ID out. Some carriers will not allow anything that's outside of the trunk out, or it will reject the call. And others require the calls to be presented in a certain way, or else they'll reject the call. Usually for billing purposes, they will use trunk or DID registration on the SIP side, which the other carrier may not require. And this can cause issues, particularly with caller ID, if you're sending something that the carrier doesn't want to see. So this is something that we would want to work with your carrier on to make sure that we can set it up for you. Also, in addition, SIP circuits are typically much better at this than PRIs, simply because, as I noted earlier, local calls across a PRI that is not local to that same area will often result in a rejection because of dialing rules. So those things are very important, and also why we typically advocate for SIP with this particular setup. It can be done, but I can certainly understand the frustration because I've seen it before. Let's see, the next question we have here. What are the requirements for VMware-based vSwitches? So this is a fairly complex question because there's a few pieces in play for this. The first and foremost piece would be the actual build of VMware does depend on the version that you have for ShoreTel. Some ShoreTel versions support 5.5, some support 6, and some support 6.5. And some actually have dropped off support for 5.5. So we would need to balance your version of ShoreTel against the version of VMware that you have so that we can make that recommendation. Then to support up to 1,000 IP phones, you'd be looking at about 2 gigs of memory, and then you need a 2.9 gigahertz or higher single core for the CPU, and 20 gigs of disk space, which has been provisioned in the VMware cluster. And then in terms of setting that up, it's as simple as going into your platform hardware, selecting primary or spare, and then in the drop down up at the top, you would select the vPhone switch. When you hit go, you're going to be asked to enter the IP address and MAC address just like any other switch. But on the right of the IP address, there's going to be a link to download the switch file. And that's going to download an OVA called bare metal install.ova, which is about a 25 megabyte file. And this is what you use to deploy the template into your VMware cluster. What will happen next is when you deploy that, you'd open your console, give it an IP address and tell it where the ShoreTel server is. And then it will connect to that ShoreTel server and download the rest of its hardware. So as it will, or its firmware rather, and then it will then basically present just like any other ShoreTel switch in the environment. It can be SSH2 and will have the same number-based CLI menu so that you can make any adjustments that you need. If I have an HQ server at our HQ site and DVS servers at all of our spoke sites, where do voicemails go exactly? Is there a configuration? It's a great question. And so where you can find the configuration for this is actually at the user level and at the workgroup level for voicemail. For each user as well as each workgroup, there is a setting for your mailbox server. And so whatever mailbox server you are set to for a user, that's where their mailbox is stored currently. By default, that's going to be the HQ server. And then that can be adjusted on the fly. Now, it's important to keep in mind that as soon as you adjust that setting, so if you move them from the HQ server to the DVS, that SMTP to move that voicemail is going to kick in right then and there. So you would want to make sure that your servers are up and communication is proper between those two servers before you make that migration change. Otherwise, you could lose voicemails. Otherwise, it is as simple as doing that in order to get your voicemail over to the server that you want. Will Inflow's collaboration with the trunk provider in order to set up a failover site at another location require an extra charge, or is this included in our Inflow support contract? This does depend on the terms of your contract. Typically, this would be an add mover change. So there would be some project hours involved. Based on my experience with a carrier, especially with a SIP circuit that's already set up, this is going to involve a test and turn up at another location, essentially a failover test to make sure that numbers work, and then you're good to go. So you're looking at least a couple of project hours. In addition, if the carrier does require a session border controller to be in play that we control, you would be looking at potentially a cost for the session border controller to be put in place, as well as configuration hours for this. So that is something to keep in mind. This would be billed as a project in most cases. What requirements are there for failing over to a remote site with just a ShoreGear 90V? So in terms of failing over for IP phone failover, all you would need is a spare switch in play, preferably at your headquarters site, and an IP phone failover turned on, and then those phones rebooted so that they have the firmware bit to know that they have IP phone failover. If that happens, then when that 90V fails, you would have the ability for those phones to actually move to another switch and they would be able to remain operational. However, the voicemail, like we mentioned before, is going to go to another voicemail box and basically be held. And depending on the connectivity, if it's also a connectivity link issue, you may just get a very generic, extension 147 is not available versus their normal greeting. So these things are important to note. If you then try to move those voicemails from the 90V to another site, just like before, that 90V operates just like the DVS server. They would try to use SMTP to get those voicemails across, and you would potentially lose any voicemails already on the 90V as a result, because the system would not know that the record still existed on the 90V. So that's very important to note. If you consolidate your switches and dial tone at 2 sites and your phones are still located at remote offices, are they treated as 2 sites for failover switch purposes? I'm not sure I follow the question here. However, if you have your dial tone at two sites and then your phones are at the remote offices, depending on how they're set up in the tree, they're going to reach out to the parent site. And you can specify another parent site. So, for example, the HQ is normally the parent for all sites in the system. You can actually change the parent at the site level so that, say you have an LA office that needs to work off the San Francisco office that we mentioned earlier, you can adjust it so that it would go to that San Francisco site as the primary. As far as the sites for failover switch for IP phone failover, if you have 2 separate sites and the parents have spares, and those sites fail, then as long as your parent site has a spare switch available, it will be able to route to that site and provide IP phone failover functionality. If you don't have a spare switch in play that is available, that is at one of those parent sites, then you will run into issues. And the same is true if you actually do change the child to be under a different parent. At that point, the parent site for that site is where the failover switch would need to be. The HQ switch is not going to be able to grab that because it is no longer considered the parent for that child site. Is it possible to run more than one edge gateway for redundancy or have a spare available? This would be something I'd have to look into. However, I am fairly certain that the edge gateway does not provide that same functionality because of the way it works. And this would also be more dependent on your DNS routing, because the way that the edge gateway works is it actually uses DNS records externally to point IP addresses to the device, which then provides the reverse proxy functionality. Because of this, if you lose that ability to do so, you would actually have to change your DNS routing to point at a different IP. So this wouldn't be an automatic process. Does the virtual switch require additional licensing? This is a great question. So as a spare, no. An IP phone failover switch set up as a spare for a virtual can be set up using just the OVA file. There is no licensing that is required there, and it will function as a functioning spare for you. There is a caveat to this. The way that ShoreTel makes sure that they are still essentially getting paid for the phones that are in use on virtuals is they do have virtual phone licenses that are used in conjunction with these virtual switches. For failover, this isn't normally a problem because just like anything else in the ShoreTel environment, you have 45 days once one of those phones registers to the virtual switch to basically fail them back. And once that's done and they're no longer on the virtual switch, then you don't have anything to worry about with licensing. Where you could potentially run into an issue is if you fail over to a virtual switch and then you just let it sit on that virtual spare for more than 45 days. Because of this, after the 45-day grace period, it is going to then lock you out of Director until you purchase a virtual phone license to unlock that. So that is important, and that is per phone. So if you have 40 phones fail over, it would show that 40 licenses are in use. When you bring that switch back up and you then fail those phones back from the spare, which is just done in the quick look tab, you can actually right under the spare, you can select fail back in the drop down menu. they will then go away and the licensing will no longer be required. As a primary switch, yes, the virtual switch does require licensing. All right, and that looks like all the questions we have right now. Does anybody else have any other questions? Here we go. We have one main site that holds the HQ, 4 remote sites that hold a DBS, and all sites have a PRI. Is it possible to consolidate all of this into one site with 2 PRIs? It is possible, but probably not what I would recommend. In addition, you might have geographic issues with consolidating all your numbers into 2 PRIs. If you wanted to consolidate, the easiest method would probably be to go with SIP, because SIP is not going to have the same geographic ties for numbers that PRIs are basically tethered to. In addition, I would honestly recommend for a situation like that, probably a redundant site with another SIP circuit for failover purposes. However, it is theoretically possible. If that's something that you're looking at, I would recommend hitting your account rep to see what your available options are, and we can work with you. However, I wouldn't advise it, because the way that your remote sites are broken down is going to allow us to more effectively help you and support your system, and also gives us more options for things like 911 and also redundancy. So there may be better options available to you. I would start a chain with your AE and see what we can do for you. He'll get you in touch with a PM and an engineer, and we can walk you through the process. Any other questions? Where do you see Mitel going with hosted appliance and ShoreTel 14.x? At this time, Mitel is not making any more changes to 14. Anything that they introduce is just hot fixes and nothing more. So the updates in regards to how virtual appliances work, there will be no updates in the future for those. All of their updates are currently being focused on ShoreTel Connect, or Mitel Connect rather.